Thank you, Matt. We are back to the Gospel of Mark tonight. How many chapters are in Mark? We're about halfway through, right? In year and a half. It's taken a year and a half. Mark chapter 6, beginning in verse 14, where we find one of those accounts that if we were taught it as children, and probably many of us were, we have not forgotten it, right? It has all the makings of a memorable story. It involves royalty, there's a sort of a love triangle, there's deceit, there's murder, beheading at the end of the account. So verse 14, King Herod heard about this. And right away we say, okay, what is the this that Herod heard about? The this is Jesus calling and empowering and sending his disciples. That was what was happening just before this in verses 7 through 11. And also their success. They were having great success, which verse 12 talks about, how they preached, they drove out demons, they healed many people. And if you look ahead over to verse 30, the same story of the disciples' ministry successes continues. So they gathered around Jesus and they reported to him all that they had done. So the first part of this passage that we're looking at tonight, what's happening here with Herod is happening at the same time the disciples are out doing the work Jesus sent them to do. Mark could have introduced this passage by saying, meanwhile, back at the king's palace or something like that. Since this is Herod's response to the ministry of Jesus and his followers as it is unfolding. So again, verse 14, King Herod heard about this, all that was going on with Jesus and his disciples. For Jesus' name had become well known. Some were saying John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, and that's why miraculous powers are at work in him. Others said he's Elijah, and still others claimed he's a prophet, like one of the prophets of long ago. But when Herod heard this, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised from the dead. These three responses to Jesus' work here are fascinating. If for no other reason, they represent some of the earliest attempts at explaining who Jesus was and how he was able to do the things he was doing. They were explanations offered by people who didn't particularly want to believe in him. But just the same, they felt compelled to come up with some explanation of the miraculous things that they'd heard about and that he and his followers were doing. So in that regard, the fact that this happened at all, these explanations were offered at all, is pretty powerful evidence that something remarkable centered in Jesus was really going on in Galilee. These are better maybe than even the witnesses of the disciples. They prove something was happening and it reached all the way to the palace. And the three of them that are suggested here, there's different nuances about them. I want to look at each one of them just briefly. The first group said, he's John the Baptist raised from the dead. Now this obviously came from a group of people who had no direct experience with either John or Jesus, other than maybe Herod himself, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And we can deduce that for several reasons. Probably the most significant is that it was this element of power. The things that Jesus and his disciples were doing were power things, and it was that caused them to think that he must be John come back to life. But John never did any miracles. John didn't have this sort of power ministry like this. They also seemed to think of Jesus as successive to John, and so they weren't aware, apparently, that Jesus and John were contemporaries. It means that they had no real understanding or awareness of Jesus before they started hearing these things in this moment. And there's a reason for that, which we'll mention in a minute. The second group said he's Elijah. Now, in contrast to the first, the resurrected John theory, this is at least a response of faith. Not only does this identify Jesus with the one John called the coming one, It also alludes to the messenger of the covenant to which Malachi 3 and 4 refer. But we know that most messianic sorts of faith that were expressed in these days had to do with this nationalistic kind of salvation that thought Elijah would return to usher in a time when the nation of Israel would be led by this conquering king to reclaim their liberty and their freedom and to restore them to their place of world domination. What they expected was the redemption of the Hebrews, of the nation of Israel, which they thought was God's favorite. That's what they expected. They weren't expecting a worldwide possibility of redemption that Jesus came to provide. So it was faith, but it was misdirected faith. But at least it was faith. The third group said more or less, he's like one of the old-time prophets. This group also showed a response of faith, and in some ways is more powerful faith than the Elijah crowd. Because God had been silent for hundreds of years. And yet some were still listening for his voice. Some were still remembering, you remember when God used to come and speak and do things in our midst. That's who Jesus reminded them of. Even though he was a lot more than a mere prophet, at least they recognized the true presence of God in him as he spoke and as he worked. And that's who they thought he was. So, as for Herod himself, he fell into the first lot. He thought that in Jesus, John had come back from the dead, and the rest of the passage here is included to explain why Herod came to that conclusion. That's why all this information is given, to explain why Herod thought Jesus was John back from the dead. Verse 17. For Herod himself had given orders to have John arrested, and he had him bound and put in prison. He did this because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, whom he married. For John had been saying to Herod, it's not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. So Herodias nursed a grudge against John and wanted to kill him, but she was not able to because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man. When Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled, yet he liked to listen to him. Okay. If it seems like you run into the name Herod over and over again in the New Testament, you're right. We do. But it's a family name. It's not the same person all the way through, okay? Different members of the family used it. and what a family this was. The family of Herod. See if you can follow me on this, okay? The first Herod was Herod the Great. That's the guy who was king by permission of the Romans, of course, when Jesus was born. And so he's the guy who massacred the little boys in Bethlehem. Okay? You got that guy? That Herod, Herod the Great, was married at least 6 times. And toward the end of his life, he became so insanely suspicious that he murdered even several of his own sons. So vicious was he. The saying came about that you were safer to be Herod's pig than you were to be his son. And it was really true. The Herod of this story is Herod Antipas. And we'll just call him Antipas from now on. Makes it simpler, okay? He was son of Herod the Great and his 5th wife. Antipas was. Herodias, the woman here, was the granddaughter of Herod the Great, the daughter of Aristobulus, who was the son of Herod the Great and his 3rd wife. Herodias originally married her half-uncle, her father's half-brother, Philip, who was the son of Herod the Great and his wife number 4. And together, Philip and Herodias had a daughter named Salome, who we're pretty sure, at least Josephus says, was the one doing the dancing here. You got this so far? Philip, who originally married Herodias, which was his half-niece. Philip did not inherit any of his father's dominions. He lived as a wealthy private citizen in Rome. And on one of Antipas's visits to Philip, Antipas, who was himself married to an Arabian princess, seduced Herodias, persuaded her to leave her husband Philip, who was, remember, Antipas's own half-brother, same father, different mothers, and to marry him. And she did. So Herodias wound up marrying in succession two of her half-uncles, two of her father's half-brothers. Let me mention, too, that this Salome, the daughter of Herodias and Philip, eventually followed in her mother's footsteps and married her own half-uncle, the son of Herod the Great and Herod's sixth wife. So if you look at the family tree, which you almost have to do to follow this, you find that Salome married her half-uncle, who was also her great half-uncle. And that's just a piece of it. I mean, I could go on. But the point is, the Herods, who claimed to be practicing Jews, were an immoral mess. And that was especially reprehensible to the Jewish sexual and relational ethic of the people that he oversaw. But you see, the Herods didn't care one bit about the people they ruled over. They did not care about what they thought. They did not care about what God thought. And you can see that also in a second way. The likely reason for Antipas not knowing much about Jesus until this moment was the fact that Antipas' official residence in Galilee was in the city of Tiberias, which Jews avoided because it was a city built on an ancient cemetery. So for a Jew to enter into that city meant that they would be unclean. And if a Jew lived in that city, they'd be perpetually unclean. And Antipas didn't care. He didn't care that the very people over which he was king could not even approach him. In fact, he probably liked it. So you can see why John the Baptist, who preached about sin and the need for wholesale repentance, might mention Antipas and Herodias and the depravity that went on in the highest levels of Jewish governance. And you can see why Herodias talked her husband Antipas into imprisoning John. She was wholly immoral. She was opportunistic. She was fully engulfed in a life of licentiousness. And here was this strange guy out in the wilderness denouncing her and what she had done. I'm sure she couldn't help, but wonder, who does this guy think he is anyway? Imagining his morals are right and mine are wrong. Well, he's just a prude. He's judgmental. He's a prejudiced, arrogant know-it-all. No, wait. He's a hater. That's what he is. That's what John the Baptist is. He's guilty of hate crimes because he doesn't accept what I think is right and true, and that makes him dangerous to me and dangerous to society, dangerous to our culture and to our way of life, and he needs to be locked up for saying what he's saying because we can't let him continue to speak in these ways. Sound familiar? The viewpoint of Herodias is very much alive and well and growing in our culture today. Proclaiming biblical convictions is called hate speech. But it's not the first time. So Herodias talked her husband into locking up John. But it's a funny thing. Herod Antipas, the man, was as complex personally as the family from which he came. Herodias obviously took John's words very personally, but Antipas didn't seem to, at least to the same degree. He didn't seem to be quite as emotionally invested in all this as his wife was, and he could somehow just ignore John when he talked like that. But even beyond that, Antipas sort of liked John. He found him intriguing. He found him engaging, even entertaining, which says something for John. I don't want to press this too far, but it does say something for John's ability to say very hard things, but still even be somewhat likable to Antipas. It speaks for John's manner, and maybe about how we could better present the whole truth in love thing without making unnecessary enemies everywhere we turn. Antipas even protected John from Herodias' vengeance for a while. But in the end, Antipas' own character flaws gave Herodias the opportunity she was looking for. Verse 21 there. Finally, the opportune time came. On his birthday, Herod gave a banquet for his high officials and his military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. When the daughter of Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guests. And the king said to the girl, "Ask me for anything you want and I'll give it to you." And he promised her with an oath, "Whatever you ask, I will give you, up to half my kingdom." And she went out and said to her mother, "What shall I ask for?" And her mother answered, "The head of John the Baptist." At once the girl hurried in to the king with the request, "I want you to give me right now the head of John the Baptist on a platter." She enhanced her request a little bit. The king was greatly distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he did not want to refuse her, so he immediately sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. The man went, beheaded John in the prison, and brought back his head on a platter. He presented it to the girl, and she gave it to her mother. On hearing this, John's disciples came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. In Antipas' pride and pomposity, he made this ridiculous offer in response to what probably was a pretty lewd and sexually charged dance performed by his own stepdaughter. Normally, prostitutes provided that kind of entertainment, which even further illustrates the moral depravity of the family. And that Antipas liked it reveals even more. And that he liked it enough to make such an offer and seal it with an oath reveals even more. Was he drunk at the time? Probably so, which reveals even more. Would he really give up half his kingdom? Have you ever wondered that when you read this? Probably not. He probably would not have done that. The phrase is really something more of an idiom that says, "I'll give you anything you want." Either way, once he said what he said, the words had no way of being retracted. So Salome, knowing her mother's fury, took the opportunity, and despite Antipas' own distress over it, in the end, he ordered John executed. Arrogance and bravado and boastfulness will get you, and very likely others in your circle, maybe people that you care something about, will get you in trouble every time. Every time. Barclay is right when he says that there's something to be learned from every person in this account. First, Herodias. Herodias is the kind of person who insists on having her way. And when that way is the way of sin, then there is no act too extreme to keep it from happening, even if it involves eliminating the one voice that had the courage to confront it. There are Herodiases today, though they may not have the power to literally kill the voice of morality, the voice of warning. They kill it in other ways. They kill it figuratively by drowning it out, or by surrounding themselves with voices of agreement. And there's no problem finding voices of agreement. You can find them online, and that's made it even easier for people to kill the voice of dissent. Or they turn up music, turn up static, just stop. Maybe they stop putting themselves into situations where a contrary voice might be heard. Stop going to church because they talk about stuff that I don't agree with. So they don't go there. What they kill is any idea contrary to their own, any thought that challenges their own, simply so they can have their way. And that may work for a time. We all have the power to kill, in one way or another, the contrary voice, such that we'll no longer have to meet it and hear it. What we have to remember, though, is that we will one day surely meet the God behind the contrary voice. And we are not able to kill him, and we are not able to drown him out on that day. We all have to remember that. Salome is the person who chooses the family connection over everything else, even when to please the family is to sin. Chances are she knew no other way, but in giving in to her mother, she took the life of a righteous and godly man. She did not pull the trigger, but she was every bit as guilty as the executioner. When we choose the way of family over the way of God, we make family the true God of our lives. And though family connections are very important, they must never become supreme. People in our day have made them so, but they must never become supreme for the life of a Christ follower. In the contest between what is right and what pleases family, the right has to prevail, or we'll surely lose both, and more likely than not forever. Herod Antipas, I said, he is a very complex guy. He could sin openly. He could fear John. He could love John. He could hate John's message, yet not be able to free himself from that message's insistence and his fascination with it. He's not quite so different as you might think. He's like one who sits in church in the morning, truly engaged and enjoying the time. Yet even while sitting there, he's planning on how he will sin that very afternoon. Herod's relationship with John was much like that which many have today with Jesus. They find him interesting, winsome, fascinating, even entertaining. They want to be around him. They want him to be around them. But in the end, they refuse to submit to him because they want their way more than his. But that sort of relationship with Jesus will never be enough. It will never be enough. It's never enough to simply be impressed by Jesus or to know about Jesus or even to know Jesus. For the relationship to mean anything worthwhile, we have to submit to Jesus. Since apart from that, there is no eternal benefit. And then there was John the Baptist. How courageous a man he was. A voice for God, even to the face of authority. If the phrase truth to power has ever been truly lived, John lived that phrase. I'm sure John did not especially want to die, but he was the kind of guy who preferred death to falsehood. He lived and he died for truth. Charged with bringing to the king the very voice of God, John obeyed his calling, even though fulfilling it meant taking his life into his own hands. And he stands as a tremendous example for us today. How often do we cower in speaking truth to even those who have no power at all over us? They could not harm us even if they wanted to, and yet we will not say half of what John the Baptist was willing to say to the king who could destroy him. John knew that there was no greater thing he could give his life for than the will of God, whatever that meant. So it's no wonder Jesus said, I tell you the truth, of all those who have ever lived, none is greater than John the Baptist. That's why Jesus said that. There's one more person in this story, though, and there's actually two more. There's the executioner. I'm not going to mention him. The other person in the story is it's really a group of people. It's the group of disciples, we're told, who came and took John's body and gave it a proper burial. They likely lived close to the prison where John was, so they could bring him what he needed to survive there, because there was no prison-provided orange jumpsuits back then, and there was no cafeteria downstairs. his friends paid a price daily to do what they did for John, for their love of him and for their love of God. And not only that, they took quite a risk aligning themselves with John, even coming for his body, especially in light of Herodias and her rage and what she had accomplished here. And yet they were faithful to their friend, clear to the end, to his end. Even when John did not know what they were doing for him, in the very end, they did it just the same. Where can faith and faithfulness be found? You surely couldn't find it in Israel's leaders. And sadly, the same is true most of the time in our day too. You can't find faith and faithfulness. Where do you find it? You find faith and faithfulness in the community of believers, the true God followers, ever since Christ. That's where you find faith and faithfulness. It's the Christ followers that minister to the contagious, to the lepers, and whatever diseases work like leprosy does in our day, even today. That is where you find faith and faithfulness, the community of believers. They're the ones who go above and beyond, living faith, obeying God in risky, sometimes radical ways, always ready to go higher and deeper for the sake of Christ. It's in that camp. That's where real faith and faithfulness is found. It's true in John's day, and it's still true today. Will there be any in our day who will follow God to such a degree that they'll do whatever he asks, faithful even to death, like John and like his disciples were? I think that's what Jesus wondered when he asked, when the Son of Man returns, how many will he find on the earth who have real faith? The essential element that separated the Herods from John's people, from Jesus' people, is what still separates people today. Will I pursue my way or will I pursue God's way? Will I be faith-filled, faithful, or will I simply do what I want? God graciously lays this choice before us. He laid it before John. He laid it before John's disciples. He laid it before Antipas and Herodias and that whole family. But as always, it's up to us which path we'll take, which way we'll pursue. Lord, our prayer tonight is that we would be found faithful like John and like John's disciples. That we would listen to your voice, not like Herodias, who refused. That we would stand for things that are true, that we know are true, and not give in to the pressures around us like Antipas wound up doing. Lord, would you show us, in either a good way or not so good way, any place in our lives that we're like any of these that arise out of this account tonight? And would you set us right? Do what you need to do to make that happen in us. In your name we pray, Jesus. Amen.